Northern France, the Picardy region, year 1916. Close your eyes. Breathe in that pure morning air deep into your lungs. Before you lies an endlessly stretching lush green valley covered in a blanket of soft morning mist. A gently blowing wind is almost dancing among the tall wheat stalks. It bends them like golden waves in a vast ocean. These are the banks of the river Somme. They are peaceful, fertile lands. For centuries, only farmers tilled the soil. Heavy draft horses ran and birds sang their timeless songs. Life flows in its own slow, beautiful rhythm in the villages made of small, ancient stone houses, where people wake up with the first light of morning, just as their ancestors did for hundreds of years before them. The comforting smell of fresh bread rises from the bakeries and mixes with the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. Sunlight filters through the dense leaves of the willow and poplar trees, creating shimmering reflections on the cool, calm waters of the river as nature breathes with all its purity and absolute beauty. Everything is so calm and quiet and so perfectly balanced that one might think time has stopped here forever, resting in a forgotten paradise, completely isolated from all the bitter troubles and cruelties of the modern world. But this deep peace is nothing more than a magnificent illusion, and that terrifying, deceptive silence just before a massive and catastrophic storm breaks. Right behind these gentle green hills, a massive and ruthless machine, created by humanity's own brilliant but destructive hands, is waiting to awaken in the shadows. These lands have witnessed many changing seasons and many golden harvests, watching over generations of fathers and sons for thousands of years. But neither this ancient geography nor the entirety of human history has ever witnessed what is about to happen on this very ground. Those innocent sunlit meadows where beautiful, fragile poppy flowers bloom so freely are very soon about to turn into one of the darkest, most agonizing, and bloodiest slaughterhouses history has ever seen, where youth is swallowed whole by the mud. Now take one last good and long look at this perfect, picturesque landscape and engrave this vibrant green and endless blue deep into your mind, etching this warm, comforting brightness into your soul. Because these are the very last innocent hours of this green valley and untouched nature before everything you see and feel changes forever, never going back to the way it was.
Those dark, heavy clouds slowly starting to gather on the horizon carry not life-giving rain, but thousands of tons of cold steel and inevitable death. That sweet, gentle breeze of the wind is slowly giving way to a chilling, unnatural cold that creeps into your bones, while the joyful sounds of the birds stop one by one, as if invisible hands have muted the world. Nature sinks into a deep, terrifying silence, as if it has sensed the absolute horror of what is about to happen to its soil. And out of that suffocating silence, another sound slowly begins to rise, as a muffled, deep, and unnatural thunder comes from very far away, even though the sky above is completely clear and blue. This is not the storm of nature or the wrath of the gods, but rather the cold, calculated, and rhythmic footsteps of the approaching industrial hell. Vibrations begin to come from the very depths of the earth as the ground beneath your feet shakes slightly at first, and then with a growing violent intensity. Those sweet flower scents brought by the wind fade away into nothingness and are forcefully replaced by that sharp, heavy smell of gunpowder and burning metal that burns your throat and stings your eyes. All the innocence of humanity and all the hopes of one generation are preparing to drown in the shallow waters of
The year is 1916, and the entire world has been dragged into a nightmare that seems to have no end. For almost 2 full years, the nations of Europe have been tearing each other apart in a brutal conflict that has completely changed the face of the earth. The romantic ideas of a quick and glorious war have been buried deep under the mud, along with the bodies of countless young men. The Western Front is now a massive open scar, tearing straight through the heart of Europe, stretching for hundreds of miles from the freezing coast of Belgium all the way to the Swiss border. This is a dead end, where all military strategy has completely collapsed into a primitive and barbaric struggle for mere yards of ruined earth. Millions of soldiers are now living like rats in deep, zigzagging trenches carved into the wet dirt. They are surrounded by an endless maze of rusted barbed wire that catches the wind and howls like crying ghosts. The space between the opposing armies is known as No Man's Land, which is a barren wasteland of waterlogged craters and unexploded artillery shells where nothing can survive for more than a few seconds. The brilliant generals who started this war are completely paralyzed because their old tactics mean absolutely nothing against the terrifying modern weapons of the 20th century. Every time an army tries to attack, they are instantly mowed down by the relentless fire of heavy machine guns that can spit out hundreds of bullets every single minute.
To advance even one single mile requires the sacrifice of tens of thousands of lives, and yet the lines on the maps remain stubbornly frozen in place. The soldiers sit in the freezing rain and suffocating mud, waiting for an order to charge into the meat grinder, knowing perfectly well that they are nothing more than numbers on a page to the men in charge. Disease and trench foot run rampant through the crowded dugouts, while the constant, deafening roar of artillery bombardments slowly shatters the minds of the strongest men, leaving them trembling in the dark. But the breaking point of this entire frozen war is happening further south, at a historic French fortress city called Verdun. The German High Command has launched a massive and utterly ruthless offensive there, with one single cold-blooded goal, which is to bleed the French army completely white. For months, the French soldiers have been thrown into the grinding teeth of the German artillery, fighting desperately for every single inch of shattered stone and poisoned earth. The French army is slowly melting away, taking unimaginable casualties every single day, and they are begging their British allies for immediate help. The British forces holding the lines around the Somme Valley realize that the entire fate of the war now rests entirely on their shoulders. They must launch a massive attack to draw the German forces away from Verdun and finally break this suffocating deadlock once and for all. The pressure is building up to a critical breaking point as the British commanders begin to draw up the plans for an offensive so massive and so destructive that it will surely crush the enemy lines and end the war. This desperate need to save the French and break the trench warfare trap is exactly what will turn the peaceful Somme Valley into the absolute center of hell on earth.
Far away from the freezing mud and the stench of rotting flesh sits a luxurious French chateau bathed in warm sunlight. This is the grand headquarters of the British High Command, where the reality of the war is nothing more than neat little lines drawn on giant paper maps. In these quiet and elegant rooms, the Supreme Commander, General Douglas Haig, and his top officers are about to play a massive game of chess with the lives of hundreds of thousands of men. They are wearing immaculate, tailored uniforms that have never touched a single drop of trench mud, and they sip fine tea while planning the ultimate destruction of the German line.
But who are the men that will carry out this gigantic offensive? They are not the seasoned professional soldiers who fought at the very beginning of the war, because most of those veterans are already dead or wounded. This new force is a massive citizen army made up of eager young volunteers who answered the patriotic call of their country. They are known as the PALS battalions. Back in 1914 and 1915, massive recruiting campaigns convinced entire communities to sign up together, with the promise that those who joined together would serve together. So thousands of friends from the same neighborhoods and factory workers from the same assembly lines and players from the same local football teams all put on the uniforms side by side. These are bakers and clerks and coal miners and university students who have never held a rifle in their entire lives before this war. They are boys who lied about their age just to go on what they thought would be a glorious European adventure. They spent months training in peaceful fields back in England, marching with wooden sticks instead of real guns, until they were finally shipped across the ocean to the absolute nightmare of the Western Front. Now these brave but terribly inexperienced young men are being moved into the staging areas right behind the Somme front lines. They sit in the crowded assembly trenches, writing letters home to their mothers and sweethearts, filled with naive optimism and blind faith in their commanders. They polish their brass buttons and sharpen their bayonets, completely unaware that the grand strategy drawn up in that beautiful chateau has fatal flaws. The generals, looking at their flat...
The gigantic gears of the British war machine finally begin to turn with a terrifying momentum as the greatest logistical operation in the history of the world takes shape right behind the front lines. Hundreds of miles of newly built railway tracks are hastily laid down across the French countryside to carry the staggering amount of supplies needed for the great offensive. Day and night, massive steam trains pull into the supply depots, carrying mountains of wooden crates filled with high explosive shells and sharp shrapnel. Thousands of exhausted horses and mules sink up to their knees in the thick, dark mud as they drag impossibly heavy artillery pieces into their firing positions, hidden among the ruined trees. The sheer scale of this preparation is absolutely mind-boggling, because the British High Command has gathered over 1.5 million artillery shells to drop on the German trenches. Every single road leading to the Somme is choked with marching men and squeaking wagons and roaring trucks, creating a massive river of khaki uniforms flowing towards the front. The young soldiers of the PALS battalions watch in absolute awe as these giant guns are wheeled into place, feeling a sudden surge of unbeatable confidence. They look at the endless piles of ammunition stacked as high as houses and truly believe that absolutely nothing can survive the apocalypse that is about to be unleashed.
Then, on the morning of June 24th, the order is finally given, and the earth literally splits open as thousands of British cannons fire at the exact same moment. The sheer physical force of the combined shockwave knocks men off their feet and shatters windows in villages located many miles away. This is the beginning of the Great Bombardment, which is a relentless 7-day storm of steel and fire that will not stop for a single second. The noise is not just a sound, but a solid, physical, crushing weight that presses against the chests of the soldiers and makes their ears bleed. It is a continuous, deafening roar that blends all the explosions into one single, endless scream of tearing metal and shattering earth. If you look towards the German lines, you cannot even see the horizon anymore, because the entire landscape is swallowed by a towering wall of thick black smoke and flying dirt. Geysers of mud and barbed wire and shattered wood are blasted hundreds of feet into the air as the heavy shells rain down without any mercy. At night, the sky turns into a terrifying and beautiful canvas of flashing red and orange lights as the constant explosions turn the darkness into an artificial and deadly daylight. The British soldiers sit in their trenches, watching the spectacular show of destruction and cheering as they imagine the German army being completely pulverized into dust.
They are told by their confident officers that the enemy wire is being cut into tiny, harmless pieces, and that the deep bunkers are collapsing like sandcastles under the incredible weight of the bombardment. But this magnificent display of firepower hides a fatal and tragic secret, because a massive portion of the 1,500,000 shells are actually defective duds that simply bury themselves in the mud without ever exploding. And the shrapnel shells that do explode are completely the wrong weapon to destroy the thick, tangled webs of German barbed wire, because they just bounce off or tangle the metal even worse. Even more terrifying is the fact that the German soldiers are not sitting out in the open waiting to be killed, but are hiding nearly 40 feet underground in heavily reinforced concrete bunkers known as Stollen. These underground fortresses are equipped with electricity and fresh water and bunk beds, allowing the German machine gunners to simply sit in the dark and wait for the storm to pass. The heavy British artillery pounds the surface, turning the ground into a completely unrecognizable moonscape of giant craters. But the men waiting deep below are surviving. For 7 agonizing days and nights, this unbelievable iron hurricane continues to rage, trying to violently reshape the earth itself. The British boys wait with fixed bayonets, completely unaware that their grand bombardment has failed to destroy the most dangerous parts of the enemy defenses, and that they are about to walk straight into a perfectly preserved trap.
While the artillery is tearing the sky apart above ground, a completely different kind of war is being waged in absolute pitch-black darkness deep beneath the mud. For many long months before the bombardment even began, special units of the British Royal Engineers, known as the tunneling companies, have been working like blind moles far below the surface. These are men who were tough coal miners in civilian life, completely used to breathing thick dust and working in intensely claustrophobic tunnels. Now they are digging incredibly narrow, cramped shafts nearly 50 feet directly underneath the heavily fortified German front lines. They work in total agonizing silence, using special silenced picks and passing the excavated clay back in small sandbags so the enemy will not see the fresh dirt accumulating on the surface. The air down there is utterly foul and thick with the smell of stale sweat and damp earth, making every single breath a desperate struggle. It is a
terrifying cat and mouse game played in the freezing dark, where the absolute slightest noise can mean instant death for everyone involved. The British tunnelers pressed their ears against the cold, wet walls, listening intently for the dreaded sound of German countermining operations, digging right back at them. Sometimes the opposing tunnels come so incredibly close that the men can actually hear the enemy soldiers talking or scraping their heavy boots through the thin, crumbling walls of dirt. If they are discovered, the Germans will drop small explosive charges down the shafts to instantly collapse the tunnels, burying the British miners alive in a suffocating, horrific tomb of crushing heavy mud. The psychological toll of knowing you could be crushed to death in the pitch black at any given second is completely unimaginable. But despite the constant, paralyzing fear of a sudden cave-in, these incredibly brave engineers continue their slow and agonizing progress, inch by inch, until they reach their designated secret targets.
Once they are perfectly positioned directly beneath the absolute strongest German machine gun nests and defensive strongpoints, they begin to pack the massive underground chambers with absolutely staggering amounts of high explosives. In one specific location, known as the Lochnagar mine, they carefully pack over 60,000 pounds of highly volatile ammonal explosives into a single massive cavern. These hidden underground bombs are specifically designed to completely vaporize the enemy defenses from the inside out and create a massive subterranean shockwave that will instantly kill or permanently stun anyone who miraculously survives the blast. They carefully wire the long electrical detonators and quietly retreat back to the safety of their own lines, leaving the deadly traps waiting patiently in the silent dark under the feet of the unsuspecting German soldiers. Now it is the foggy morning of July 1, and the great 7-day artillery bombardment has suddenly reached its absolute deafening peak. The young, inexperienced soldiers of the PALS battalions are standing shoulder to shoulder in the crowded staging trenches, gripping their heavy rifles with sweaty, trembling hands.
The solid earth suddenly bulges upwards as if a giant ancient monster is trying to violently break free from the center of the world. A tiny fraction of a second later, the ground completely ruptures, and absolutely gigantic, towering pillars of intense fire and pulverized white chalk shoot thousands of feet straight into the hazy morning sky. The massive explosion at the Lochnagar crater is so impossibly huge that the deafening roar of the blast can actually be heard clearly by people walking the peaceful streets of London hundreds of miles away across the ocean. Whole sections of the German trench system, along with the hundreds of men trapped inside, are completely vaporized in a blinding, terrifying flash of white-hot energy, leaving behind colossal, gaping craters that look exactly like the surface of the moon. As the massive, heavy chunks of debris and giant clods of earth begin to rain back down violently on the shattered battlefield, the British soldiers stare in absolute paralyzed shock at the towering, apocalyptic mushroom clouds of dust rising high above the enemy lines. They tighten the canvas straps on their steel helmets and wait for the shrill officer whistles to blow, because the giant gates of hell have just been blasted wide open, and it is finally time to walk straight through them. The heavy air is completely thick with chalk dust and suffocating smoke from the massive underground explosions. It is exactly 7:30 in the morning on July 1. The grand artillery barrage that has been roaring for 7 agonizing days suddenly stops. The sudden silence is absolutely terrifying. It is a heavy, crushing silence that presses against the eardrums of 100,000 young men waiting in the deep trenches. They're standing shoulder to shoulder in the damp clay. Most of them are only 18 or 19 years old. They're the boys of the PALS battalions. They're factory workers and clerks who have never seen real combat before this very moment. They hold their heavy rifles with white knuckles. Their bayonets are fixed and gleaming dully in the hazy morning sunlight. Each man has been given a small ration of strong rum to calm his completely shattered nerves.
but nothing can stop the violent shaking of their hands. They look at the wooden ladders leaning against the trench walls. These crude wooden steps lead directly up into the completely unknown terror of no man's land.
This fatal decision to walk is made even worse by the absolutely staggering amount of heavy equipment they are forced to carry. Each soldier is completely weighed down by nearly 66 pounds of gear. They have heavy steel helmets and thick woolen uniforms that are already soaking wet from the morning dew. They carry canvas packs filled with hundreds of rounds of extra ammunition and heavy metal entrenching tools. They have thick sandbags rolled up and strapped to their chests to help rebuild the captured trenches. They carry massive coils of heavy barbed wire and thick wooden stakes on their tired shoulders. Some men even carry cages containing live carrier pigeons. They are essentially walking pack mules loaded down with the physical weight of the entire British Army. This massive burden makes it absolutely impossible for them to move quickly or dodge any incoming fire. They can only trudge forward slowly, leaning into the heavy burden like men walking into a massive freezing blizzard. They stumble over the uneven, blasted ground. They fall into deep, waterlogged craters and struggle desperately to climb back out onto the massive weight of their packs. The officers lead the way, carrying only small, leather-wrapped walking sticks and heavy revolvers. They shout words of absolute encouragement to their frightened men. They tell them to keep a steady pace and hold the line and never rush. The men obey blindly because that is exactly what they have been trained to do for months. They trust their officers, and they trust the grand plan. The massive line of khaki uniforms stretches out to the left and to the right as far as the human eye can possibly see. It is an absolutely awe-inspiring sight. 100,000 men moving as one single massive breathing entity across the dead earth. They step over the twisted, ruined bodies of dead horses and the shattered, rusted remains of old artillery pieces. The ground is completely soft and treacherous. The thick, wet clay grabs desperately at their heavy boots, trying to pull them down into the mud. Every single step requires a massive physical effort. Their breathing becomes heavy and ragged as the adrenaline pumps violently through their terrified young veins. This fatal decision to walk is made even worse by the absolutely staggering amount of heavy equipment they are forced to carry. Each soldier is completely weighed down by nearly 66 pounds of gear. They have heavy steel helmets and thick woolen uniforms that are already soaking wet from the morning dew. They carry canvas packs filled with hundreds of rounds of extra ammunition and heavy metal entrenching tools. They have thick sandbags rolled up and strapped to their chests to help rebuild the captured trenches. They carry massive coils of heavy barbed wire and thick wooden stakes on their tired shoulders. Some men even carry cages containing live carrier pigeons. They are essentially walking pack mules loaded down with the physical weight of the entire British Army. This massive burden makes it absolutely impossible for them to move quickly or dodge any incoming fire. They can only trudge forward slowly, leaning into the heavy burden like men walking into a massive freezing blizzard. They stumble over the uneven, blasted ground. They fall into deep, waterlogged craters and struggle desperately to climb back out onto the massive weight of their packs. The officers lead the way, carrying only small, leather-wrapped walking sticks and heavy revolvers. They shout words of absolute encouragement to their frightened men. They tell them to keep a steady pace and hold the line and never rush. The men obey blindly because that is exactly what they have been trained to do for months. They trust their officers, and they trust the grand plan. The massive line of khaki uniforms stretches out to the left and to the right as far as the human eye can possibly see. It is an absolutely awe-inspiring sight. 100,000 men moving as one single massive breathing entity across the dead earth.
They step over the twisted, ruined bodies of dead horses, shattered, rusted remains of old artillery pieces. The ground is completely soft and treacherous. The thick, wet clay grabs desperately at their heavy boots, trying to pull them down into the mud. Every single step requires a massive physical effort. Their breathing becomes heavy and ragged as the adrenaline pumps violently through their terrified young veins.
The sunlight slowly begins to burn away the thick morning fog, revealing the absolute vastness of no man's land. In some places, this deadly strip of contested earth is over 1 mile wide. In other places, it is only 100 yards. But right now, it feels like an absolutely endless desert of destruction. The men can see the rusted tangles of old barbed wire from previous failed attacks. They see the bleached white bones of unknown soldiers who died in this exact same spot years ago. It is a massive open graveyard. Yet they continue to walk forward at that slow, agonizingly steady pace. The weight of the 66 pounds of equipment cuts deep into their tired shoulders. The canvas straps dig into their skin. Sweat pours down their faces, cutting clean tracks through the thick layers of black soot and white chalk dust. Some of the boys quietly whisper prayers under their breath. Others just stare completely blankly ahead, focusing entirely on the back of the man walking directly in front of them. They are trapped in a terrifying trance of absolute obedience and over.
But deep under the ground, the surviving German soldiers have already felt the massive tremors of the exploding mines. They survived the 7-day bombardment safely hidden in their deep, reinforced concrete bunkers, 40 feet below the surface. The sudden silence of the British artillery is their absolute signal to move. They rush frantically up the steep concrete stairs, dragging their heavy machine guns and massive belts of brass ammunition. They emerge from the deep, dark earth, covered in white chalk dust. They look out across the ruined battlefield, and they simply cannot believe their own eyes. They see tens of thousands of British soldiers walking slowly upright in perfectly straight lines right toward them. The German gunners quickly mount their deadly weapons on the shattered trench parapets. They chamber the first heavy rounds and take careful aim at the slowly advancing waves of young men. The British soldiers are still walking slowly forward, completely unaware that they are staring directly into the terrifying mechanical eyes of the absolute worst industrial slaughter in human history. The terrible silence of no man's land is about to be shattered forever.
Deep beneath the shattered crust of the earth, the German soldiers are completely alive. The British generals were absolutely wrong. For 7 long, terrifying days, the German infantry sat in pitch-black darkness. They were hiding inside massive underground fortresses called Stollen. These are not simple muddy ditches, but incredible feats of modern engineering. They are dug 40 feet deep into the solid white chalk. They have thick, reinforced concrete walls and heavy wooden bunk beds. They even have electrical wiring and pumping systems to keep the freezing water out. While the British artillery pounded the surface into a completely unrecognizable moonscape, the men down below simply waited. The earth above them shook violently. The heavy dust fell from the ceilings and choked their lungs. Many men went completely mad from the constant crushing vibration. But the vast majority of the German defenders survived the storm of steel completely intact. They sat in the dark, gripping their rifles and praying for the terrifying noise to end. Then, the deafening roar of the heavy British artillery suddenly stops. The sudden silence is not a relief, but a terrifying alarm bell. The German commanders know exactly what this silence means. It means the British infantry is finally coming. Orders are frantically scurrying into the dark, cramped tunnels.
The German soldiers quickly set up the ultimate weapon of industrial slaughter. It is the terrifying Maschinengewehr 08. It is a massive, heavy, mechanical beast made of cold black steel.
It sits on a heavy metal sled mount that makes it incredibly stable. It has a thick metal water jacket around the barrel to keep it from melting down during continuous fire. This terrifying machine can spit out 500 heavy bullets every single minute. It does not require aiming in the traditional human sense. It simply requires a man to hold down the heavy thumb trigger and sweep the barrel back and forth like a gardener watering a lawn. It is a weapon designed specifically to kill as many human beings as possible in the shortest amount of time. The gunners quickly feed the long cloth belts holding the brass bullets into the side of the weapon. They pull back the heavy charging handle with a loud metallic clack. The machine is fully awake and utterly hungry for blood. The German gunners look out over the shattered remains of their own barbed wire. They wipe the sweat and dust from their eyes. They simply cannot comprehend the sight unfolding right in front of them. It is a scene of absolute madness. They expect to see soldiers running and dodging from crater to crater. Instead, they see a massive wall of khaki uniforms walking slowly and casually in perfectly straight lines. Tens of thousands of British boys are strolling across the completely open ground. The sun is shining directly on their bright metal bayonets, making them perfect, gleaming targets. The German soldiers actually hesitate for a brief second. The sight is so completely absurd and so tragically foolish that they are momentarily paralyzed by disbelief. Some German officers later write that they felt a deep, sickening pity for the young men walking toward them. But in a brutal war of survival, pity is a luxury nobody can afford. The loud, aggressive screams of the German officers quickly break the spell. They order their men to open fire.
The gunners press their thumbs hard against the heavy metal triggers. The peaceful morning air is instantly, violently shattered by a terrifying noise. It sounds exactly like giant sheets of thick canvas being ripped perfectly in half. It is the rapid mechanical stutter of hundreds of machine guns opening fire at the exact same time. The air is instantly filled with a massive, invisible swarm of flying lead. Millions of hot bullets tear across the empty space of no man's land. They travel at supersonic speeds, cutting cleanly through the smoke and fog. The perfectly straight lines of the British infantry are hit by a completely invisible wall of kinetic energy. The heavy bullets do not just pierce the soft bodies, they completely shatter bones and tear limbs from torsos. The first wave of British soldiers falls almost simultaneously. It looks exactly like a giant invisible scythe has swung brutally across a massive field of tall green wheat. Hundreds of young men simply cease to exist in a fraction of a single second.
The boys in the second and third lines watch in absolute frozen horror as their friends are violently cut down right in front of them. The air is filled with the terrifying sharp cracks of passing bullets and the agonizing screams of the wounded. But the British soldiers cannot run away or dive for cover. The 66 pounds of heavy equipment strapped to their chests and backs makes them completely clumsy and dangerously slow. They are completely exposed on the flat, open ground. There is absolutely no cover to be found. The shallow craters are already filling up with dead and dying men. They try to lean forward into the invisible storm of lead, as if they are walking into a heavy, freezing rain. But bullets do not care about human bravery. The brave officers leading the charge are the very first to die. The German gunners specifically target the men holding the leather walking sticks and shouting the orders. Without their leaders, the young, inexperienced boys are completely lost in the chaos.
They freeze in the absolute middle of the killing zone, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming noise and the sheer scale of the destruction. They become completely static targets for the relentless German machine guns. The water inside the cooling jackets of the German guns literally boils and turns to hot steam from the sheer friction of firing so many bullets. The metal guns glow red hot, but the desperate gunners just keep feeding in more and more belts of heavy ammunition. The slaughter is completely mechanical and utterly devoid of any human emotion.
Men are dropping in clusters, falling over each other in massive, tangled heaps of bloody khaki fabric. The grand plan of the British High Command has failed completely and absolutely. The confident Big Push has instantly turned into the most spectacular and horrific mass suicide in military history. The green valley of the Somme is now rapidly filling with the blood of an entire ruined generation as the morning sun climbs higher into the indifferent sky.
The terrifying invisible wall of lead continues to violently shred the morning air. The British soldiers who somehow miraculously survived the initial devastating volley of machine gun fire realize they cannot turn back. They are trapped in a complete nightmare of noise and flying mud. The only possible way to survive is to keep desperately moving forward toward the very guns that are butchering them. They lower their heads and trudge blindly through the shattered landscape. They step over the lifeless bodies of boys they went to school with and boys they played football with. The thick mud pulls at their boots like a dark, heavy monster trying to drag them down into the earth. The overwhelming stench of fresh blood mixes violently with the sharp metallic smell of cordite and burning explosives. The boys are completely deafened by the constant roaring thunder of the guns. They can only hear their own panicked heartbeats pounding wildly in their ears.
But as the surviving remnants of the first wave finally approach the edges of the German trenches, they encounter the absolute worst failure of the entire British grand plan. The massive artillery bombardment that was supposed to completely obliterate the enemy defenses has failed in the most spectacular and horrific way imaginable. The heavy, high-explosive shells simply bounced off the massive rolls of German barbed wire. The shrapnel shells only succeeded in lifting the heavy wire into the air and dropping it back down into even more complicated and totally impassable tangled knots. The British soldiers find themselves standing completely exposed in front of a terrifying solid wall of rusted, razor-sharp metal. The wire is completely intact. It sits in massive, thick belts that are over 30 feet deep and 10 feet high. It is an absolutely impenetrable metal jungle designed specifically to trap human beings like helpless animals in a massive, deadly snare.
The young boys stare in complete, terrified disbelief at the towering walls of twisted metal. The heavy wire cutters they were issued are completely and utterly useless. They are too small and too weak to cut through the incredibly thick steel cables used by the German engineers. The soldiers try desperately to find tiny, narrow gaps in the massive wire belts. They run frantically back and forth along the jagged edges, completely exposed to the relentless enemy fire. This is exactly what the German machine gunners were waiting for. The thick wire is specifically placed to funnel the attacking soldiers into highly concentrated areas known as kill zones. The heavy machine guns are perfectly sighted to fire directly into these narrow bottlenecks.
As the British soldiers crowd tightly together, trying desperately to squeeze through the small openings, they create massive, completely unmissable targets. The German gunners do not even need to aim anymore. They simply point their glowing, red-hot barrels into the massive, panicked crowds and hold down the heavy triggers. The slaughter here is so absolute and so incredibly dense that it simply defies all human comprehension. The bodies of the young British boys begin to pile up violently against the thick, rusted wire. They become tangled in the sharp metal barbs, completely unable to fall to the muddy ground even after they have been shot multiple times. The heavy, dead weight of their bodies pulls the wire taut, creating a horrifying wall of human flesh and torn khaki uniforms.
Those who are not instantly killed are caught completely helpless in the sharp metal teeth. The heavy barbs tear through their thick uniforms and rip deeply into their soft flesh. They hang there in the bright morning sunlight, screaming in absolute agonizing pain. They are bleeding to death slowly, caught like desperate flies in a massive, deadly metal spiderweb. The German gunners show absolutely no mercy because there is no room for mercy in this completely mechanical slaughterhouse. They continue to fire relentlessly into the massive piles of tangled bodies, ensuring that nothing is left alive in the kill zones. The sharp staccato rhythm of the guns sounds like a massive industrial sewing machine, stitching a terrifying tapestry of absolute death.
Some incredibly brave and completely desperate British soldiers actually try to throw their own bodies directly onto the top of the sharp wire. They willingly sacrifice themselves to create a horrific human bridge of flesh and bone. They scream for their terrified friends to step directly onto their backs and run over them to get to the enemy trenches. But even this unbelievable act of supreme human sacrifice is completely useless.
The men trying to run across the bodies are instantly shot down, falling heavily into the tangled metal mess alongside their dead friends. The entire area immediately in front of the German wire becomes a massive, horrific graveyard.
The young boys of the PALS battalions who marched so proudly out of their peaceful hometowns just a few months ago are now hanging lifeless in the rusted metal. Their bright, optimistic letters home are still sitting securely in their chest pockets, soaking slowly with their own blood. The massive 66-pound packs they carried on their backs are now completely useless anchors, keeping their torn bodies pinned to the wire. The grand strategy of the British High Command has completely collapsed into a total, disorganized massacre. The magnificent Big Push has ground to a violent, bloody halt right in front of the completely unbroken German defenses. The generals sitting comfortably in their luxurious chateau miles away have absolutely no idea of the complete and utter catastrophe that is unfolding. The Somme Valley is rapidly drinking the blood of an entire generation as the relentless guns continue their absolutely deafening mechanical song of death.
The massive slaughter happening in the muddy fields of the Somme is completely invisible to the men who actually ordered it. Miles away from the deafening roar of the artillery, the British High Command sits in perfectly quiet, luxurious rooms. General Douglas Haig and his staff officers are staring intensely at giant, clean paper maps. They are waiting desperately for good news from the front lines. But the first casualty of this massive industrial war is the absolute truth. In 1916, the technology for military communication is incredibly primitive and completely fragile. The British Army relies heavily on miles of thin copper telephone wires buried just a few feet under the thick mud. But the intense 7-day artillery bombardment and the massive explosions of the underground mines have completely severed all of these vital lifelines. The telephone cables are violently ripped into thousands of useless pieces. The generals pick up their heavy black receivers and hear absolutely nothing but a terrifying dead static. They are completely blind and deaf to the absolute catastrophe unfolding just a few miles away.
Without working telephones, the commanders in the rear trenches have to rely on visual signals. They stare through heavy brass binoculars, trying to see colored flares or signal flags waving in the distance. But the battlefield is completely covered in a thick, impenetrable fog of war. A massive dark cloud of white chalk dust and black cordite smoke and burning sulfur completely swallows the entire valley. The bright morning sky is completely blotted out by the debris of 100,000 exploding shells. The officers cannot see more than 50 yards in front of their own faces. They look toward the German lines and see absolutely nothing but a swirling gray nightmare. They cannot see the massive piles of dead boys tangled in the rusted barbed wire. They cannot see the desperate, bleeding survivors pinned down in the muddy craters. They simply assume that the heavy smoke is hiding a glorious British victory.
The massive slaughter happening in the muddy fields of the Somme is completely invisible to the men who actually ordered it. Miles away from the deafening roar of the artillery, the British High Command sits in perfectly quiet, luxurious rooms. General Douglas Haig and his staff officers are staring intensely at giant, clean paper maps. They are waiting desperately for good news from the front lines. But the first casualty of this massive industrial war is the absolute truth. In 1916, the technology for military communication is incredibly primitive and completely fragile. The British Army relies heavily on miles of thin copper telephone wires buried just a few feet under the thick mud. But the intense 7-day artillery bombardment and the massive explosions of the underground mines have completely severed all of these vital lifelines. The telephone cables are violently ripped into thousands of useless pieces. The generals pick up their heavy black receivers and hear absolutely nothing but a terrifying dead static. They are completely blind and deaf to the absolute catastrophe unfolding just a few miles away. Without working telephones, the commanders in the rear trenches have to rely on visual signals. They stare through heavy brass binoculars, trying to see colored flares or signal flags waving in the distance. But the battlefield is completely covered in a thick, impenetrable fog of war. A massive dark cloud of white chalk dust and black cordite smoke and burning sulfur completely swallows the entire valley. The bright morning sky is completely blotted out by the debris of 100,000 exploding shells. The officers cannot see more than 50 yards in front of their own faces. They look toward the German lines and see absolutely nothing but a swirling gray nightmare. They cannot see the massive piles of dead boys tangled in the rusted barbed wire. They cannot see the desperate, bleeding survivors pinned down in the muddy craters. They simply assume that the heavy smoke is hiding a glorious British victory.
In a desperate attempt to get accurate information, the frontline officers send out human runners. These are the fastest and bravest young boys in the entire army. They are ordered to sprint back through the muddy.
Some isolated battalions try to use carrier pigeons to send messages back to headquarters. They nervously release the small, terrified birds from wicker baskets into the toxic air. But the sky is filled with deafening explosions and thick, suffocating smoke. Many pigeons are instantly blown out of the sky by flying hot shrapnel. Others are completely disoriented by the massive concussive shockwaves and fly in the completely wrong directions. The flow of vital information completely bleeds to death in the mud. The massive British army has been completely decapitated from its own brain. The front line is fighting a completely isolated, brutal battle of survival, while the generals in the rear are living in a dangerous and completely fictional fantasy world.
Because they hear absolutely nothing, the High Command assumes that everything is going exactly according to their flawless grand plan. They look at their synchronized pocket watches and see that it is officially time for the next phase of the grand attack. They firmly believe that the first wave of infantry has successfully captured the German trenches and is now pushing much deeper into enemy territory. This catastrophic misunderstanding leads to the absolute most heartbreaking orders of the entire day. General Haig and his blind commanders officially order the second and third waves of infantry to begin their advance. They are knowingly feeding entirely fresh battalions directly into the exact same mechanical meat grinder.
Back in the crowded staging trenches, the boys of the second wave have been listening to the terrifying roar of the machine guns for hours. They have seen the bloody stretchers coming back. They know deep in their terrified hearts that the grand attack is a total disaster. But when the senior officers arrive with the strict orders to advance, they have absolutely no choice. Military discipline completely overrides their basic human instinct to survive. They fix their sharp bayonets and climb the muddy wooden ladders with incredibly heavy hearts. They step out into the swirling gray smoke and immediately trip over the dead bodies of the first wave. They are forced to literally trample over the ruined faces of their own dead friends just to move forward. The German machine gunners, peering through the smoke, see the fresh silhouettes emerging from the thick dust. The water inside their heavy gun jackets boils violently as they pull the cold steel triggers once again. The deafening ripping sound of the guns echoes across the valley as the tragic cycle of slaughter completely repeats itself. The complete collapse of communication turns a terrible defeat into an absolute apocalyptic nightmare. The brilliant generals sitting in their quiet, distant chateau are blindly murdering their own men with every single tick of the clock.
It is now exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The bright summer sun is completely obscured by a thick, choking ceiling of gray smoke and flying dirt. Down in the crowded reserve trenches, the young men of the second wave are waiting in a state of absolute psychological agony. They are the brothers and friends and neighbors of the boys who went over the top just 30 minutes ago. They have heard the terrifying, uninterrupted roar of the German machine guns. They have seen the bloody, completely mangled survivors desperately crawling back to the safety of the mud. The horrifying reality of the situation is no longer a secret to anyone. They know with absolute certainty that the grand attack has completely failed. They know the heavy artillery did not destroy the massive barbed wire. They know the German gunners are completely alive and waiting patiently for them. Yet they stand shoulder to shoulder, gripping their heavy rifles with violently shaking hands.
They are trapped perfectly inside the rigid iron cage of military discipline. To refuse a direct order to advance is considered absolute treason. It is a crime punishable by death in front of a firing squad made up of their own friends. So they wait for the inevitable whistle, trapped completely between the absolute certainty of death in front of them and the deep disgrace of cowardice behind them. The junior officers look at the terrified, pale faces of their young men. Many of these officers are just normal school teachers or bank clerks who join the army out of a deep patriotic duty. They know exactly what they are asking these boys to do. They are asking them to commit mass suicide in the mud. But the orders from the distant high command are completely absolute and totally blind to the reality of the slaughter.
The shrill mechanical scream of the silver whistle pierces the heavy air once again. It is a terrible sound that will violently haunt the dark dreams of the few survivors for the rest of their natural lives. The boys of the second wave begin to climb the slippery wooden ladders. As they lift their heavy steel helmets above the parapet, they are greeted by a sight that completely breaks their minds.
The previously empty space of no man's land is now entirely covered by a massive, continuous carpet of khaki fabric. It looks exactly as if a massive brown snowstorm has completely blanketed the entire valley. But this heavy blanket is made entirely of human bodies. Thousands of their close friends are lying completely dead or screaming in absolute unimaginable agony.
The second wave steps out of the trench and immediately faces a completely impossible physical task. There was absolutely no clear ground left to walk on. In order to move forward, they are forced to literally step directly on the ruined, bleeding bodies of the first wave. They feel the sickening soft crunch of human bones under their heavy hobnailed boots. They look down and clearly recognize the torn faces of boys they went to school with. They see the completely lifeless eyes of boys they played football with in the quiet streets of their hometowns. They hear the desperate pleas of the wounded, begging them not to step on their shattered legs or bleeding chests. But the immense physical pressure of the men advancing right behind them forces them to keep moving blindly forward. They are forced to trample their own brothers deep into the bloody mud.
This is the absolute darkest and most heartbreaking center of the Pals Battalion's tragedy. These unique units were specifically formed from men who lived in the exact same neighborhoods and worked in the exact same factories. The British government originally thought it would perfectly build strong morale if friends fought side by side. But on the horrific morning of July 1, this romantic idea turns into an apocalyptic nightmare for entire innocent communities back in England. When the glowing German machine guns open fire on these specific localized battalions, they do not just kill random isolated soldiers. They completely eradicate the entire male youth of specific towns in a matter of mere minutes. Every single postman and butcher and baker from one single street is violently wiped off the face of the earth at the exact same moment. Back home, there will be quiet streets where absolutely every single house receives a fatal black telegram on the exact same day.
The boys walk slowly into the churning mechanical meat grinder, just like the doomed wave before them. The water inside the heavy cooling jackets of the German machine guns is still boiling violently from the previous massive slaughter. The exhausted gunners wipe the dark explosive soot from their tired eyes and simply hold down the heavy triggers once more. The massive invisible wall of supersonic lead violently strikes the second wave. The fresh bodies fall heavily onto the dead bodies that are already lying there. The horrific piles of the dead grow higher and higher, providing a gruesome, bloody cover for the few desperate men still trying to crawl forward on their stomachs. The massive weight of their 66-pound packs drags them down heavily into the deep waterlogged craters. The muddy water inside the holes quickly turns a dark, terrifying red. Young men actually drown in just a few inches of bloody water simply because they're too heavily loaded and completely exhausted to lift their own heavy heads.
The noise is so completely overwhelming that men lose all sense of physical balance and mental direction. Some boys completely lose their minds from the sheer unending terror of the situation. They drop their heavy rifles and wander aimlessly through the flying supersonic bullets, laughing hysterically or crying desperately for their mothers. They are instantly cut down by the relentless crossfire. Others try to desperately dig into the hard white chalk with their bare, bleeding hands, trying to create a tiny hole to hide their heads in. Their fingernails break and bleed heavily as the bullets crack loudly just inches above their helmets. The heavy German artillery finally joins the massive slaughter, firing huge, high-explosive shells directly into the extremely crowded no man's land. The massive explosions violently toss the dead and the living high into the toxic air, mingling their torn bodies together in a terrifying heavy rain of flesh and mud.
The brave officers who are still miraculously alive completely realize the absolute futility of the entire attack. But they have absolutely no way to stop the thousands of men still pouring out of the rear communication trenches. The massive, heavy gears of the military machine simply cannot be reversed. The blind and deaf commanders sitting in the distant, luxurious chateaus continue to issue the exact same fatal orders. They assume the total lack of communication simply means the troops are advancing rapidly deep into German territory. So the third wave is violently pushed forward to follow the exact doomed footsteps of the first and the second. The beautiful green valley of the Somme has been completely and violently transformed into a deep, dark ocean of human suffering. The blood of the young, naive volunteers flows so heavily that it actually begins to pool deep in the bottom of the massive artillery craters.
the sheer scale of the waste is absolutely impossible to justify or comprehend. These young boys were promised a great, glorious adventure that would finally end the terrible war. Instead, they are being methodically and mechanically butchered in the absolute prime of their young lives. The morning sun continues to rise slowly in the hazy, smoke-filled sky, shining a completely indifferent bright light on the greatest man-made tragedy the world has ever seen.
To truly understand the massive scale of the tragedy, we must zoom in on one specific sector of the massive front. At the northern edge of the battlefield lies the completely ruined French village of Beaumont-Hamel. The German army has turned this quiet farming village into an absolutely impregnable underground fortress. Deep in the muddy reserve trenches facing this terrible fortress waits a very unique group of soldiers. They are not factory workers from the crowded cities of England. They are rugged fishermen and loggers from a freezing, isolated island far across the massive Atlantic Ocean. They are the 1st Newfoundland Regiment. They have traveled thousands of miles from their quiet homes to fight for an empire they have never even seen. They are strong, proud boys who are used to the harsh, brutal storms of the freezing ocean. But absolutely nothing could have prepared them for the mechanical storm of steel they are about to face.
It is around 9 in the morning, and the attack in this sector is already a complete catastrophic failure. The first wave of British troops has been completely massacred, and their bodies are hanging heavily in the unbroken German barbed wire. The incredibly narrow communication trenches leading to the front lines are completely choked with the dead and the bleeding wounded. It is physically impossible to move through them. But the blind generals sitting in the rear still demand that the attack must continue at all costs. The orders arrive for the brave boys of Newfoundland to begin their advance. Because the trenches are completely blocked, they're forced to do something absolutely suicidal. They have to climb out of their reserve trenches and walk across the completely open ground just to reach their own starting line.
The moment they pull themselves up over the mud, they are perfectly silhouetted against the bright morning skyline. The German machine gunners, hiding safely in the deep concrete ruins of Beaumont-Hamel, have a completely clear, unobstructed view of the entire regiment. The mechanical slaughter begins before the boys even reach the edges of no man's land. The completely open ground offers absolutely no cover. The boys tuck their chins down deep into their chests, exactly as if they are walking directly into a freezing winter blizzard back home. They walk slowly and steadily forward, completely ignoring the terrifying supersonic cracks of the passing bullets. They are brave beyond all human comprehension.
In the exact middle of the ruined lunar landscape stands a single shattered wooden skeleton. It is the blasted trunk of an old apple tree that the troops have ominously named the Danger Tree. Because it is the only recognizable landmark left standing in the thick, swirling gray smoke, the boys naturally use it as a guide. They instinctually walk directly toward the dead wooden trunk, trying to keep their formation straight. But this is a fatal and tragic mistake. The German artillery and machine gunners have already perfectly pre-sighted their heavy weapons directly on that exact tree. They know exactly how far away it is, and they know perfectly how to hit it.
As the massive waves of Newfoundland boys approach the shattered tree, they step directly into a perfectly designed kill zone. The heavy machine gun fire hits them violently from 3 different directions at the exact same time. The invisible wall of supersonic lead violently tears through their ranks. The area immediately surrounding the Danger Tree turns into a massive, horrific slaughterhouse in a matter of mere seconds. The boys fall heavily into the deep grass and the muddy craters. They are cut down in massive clusters. The incredibly brave officers holding their small leather sticks try desperately to lead them through the chaotic storm of metal. But the officers are instantly, violently killed. Without leaders, the surviving boys try to crawl blindly through the thick mud. But the incredibly heavy 66-pound packs on their backs make them completely easy targets.
The entire desperate attack of the Newfoundland Regiment lasts for less than 30 agonizing minutes. In that incredibly short fraction of time, a proud and beautiful generation is completely wiped off the face of the earth. The machine guns finally stop firing only because there are absolutely no standing targets left to kill. Of the 801 brave young men who proudly climbed out of the trenches that morning, only 68 are able to answer the roll call the very next day. Over 700 strong, beautiful boys from a tiny island are lying completely dead or slowly bleeding to death in the French mud.
For the small, tight-knit community of Newfoundland, this is an absolute generational catastrophe. There is not one single street or fishing village back home that does not lose a son or a brother or a father on this horrific day. The tragic massacre at the Danger Tree becomes a massive, completely open wound for an entire nation. It is a terrifying, localized nightmare that perfectly represents the absolute useless slaughter of the entire Somme offensive.
The bright summer sun is now hanging completely high in the terrifying gray sky. The massive mechanical slaughter has finally begun to slow down, but only because the German machine guns have run out of living targets to shoot at. The space between the trenches is completely covered by a massive moving carpet of human agony. There are over 30,000 wounded British soldiers lying completely helpless in the thick mud of no man's land. They are bleeding heavily from terrible jagged wounds caused by supersonic bullets and jagged flying shrapnel. They are crying out for their mothers and begging desperately for a single drop of water. This is the exact moment when the absolute best of human nature completely collides with the absolute worst of industrial technology.
From the safety of the shattered British trenches emerge the unarmed heroes of this terrifying apocalypse. They are the medics and the stretcher bearers of the Royal Army Medical Corps. They do not carry heavy rifles or sharp bayonets. Their only protection is a small piece of white cloth with a red cross stitched onto their arms. They look out at the terrifying ocean of flying lead, and they willingly choose to climb over the top. They step out into the completely open killing fields to save the shattered lives of the boys who fell. The bravery required to do this is absolutely impossible to properly describe with simple human words. They walk completely upright through the buzzing swarms of sniper bullets and the massive concussive blasts of high-explosive artillery shells.
It takes 4 exhausted men to carry one single heavy canvas stretcher through the thick, clinging mud. The physical effort is absolutely agonizing. They slip and slide down into the deep, waterlogged craters while trying desperately not to drop the screaming, wounded boys they are carrying. Every single time they stand up to lift the heavy stretcher, they become a perfect, totally exposed target for the German gunners. Many of these incredibly brave medics are instantly, violently killed right alongside the boys they are desperately trying to save. When one stretcher bearer falls violently dead into the mud, another unarmed boy instantly runs out from the trench to take his exact place. They drag the heavily bleeding boys back to the completely overwhelmed medical stations hidden deep in the muddy communication trenches.
These underground hospitals quickly become scenes of absolute apocalyptic horror. The doctors and surgeons are completely covered in thick, dark blood from their heads to their boots. They have completely run out of clean white bandages and precious pain-killing morphine. They are forced to perform terrible amputations with dull surgical saws while the massive artillery shells shake the dirt from the ceiling directly into the open wounds. The sheer overwhelming number of shattered, broken bodies completely breaks the minds of the medical staff. But they refuse to stop working because every single wasted second means another young boy bleeds to death on the muddy floor.
Out in the absolute middle of the terrifying killing fields, there are thousands of wounded boys who simply cannot be reached by the brave stretcher bearers. They are trapped completely behind the massive tangled walls of rusted German barbed wire, or pinned down deep inside the massive artillery craters. For these isolated boys, the battle turns into an absolutely agonizing test of personal human endurance. They have to play completely dead while the German machine gun bullets violently snap just a few inches above their steel helmets. They pull the cold, lifeless bodies of their dead friends directly on top of themselves to use them as bloody human shields against the flying shrapnel.
The bright sun beats down relentlessly on their heavy woolen uniforms, turning their terrible open wounds into burning agonies. The intense physical shock and the massive loss of blood make them incredibly thirsty. They blindly drink the dark, toxic water pooling at the absolute bottom of the craters, even though it is heavily mixed with explosives and human waste. They know that if they raise their heads even one single inch to call for help, a German sniper will instantly put a heavy bullet straight through their brains. So they lie completely still in the wet, suffocating mud, surrounded entirely by the rotting corpses of their brothers. They stare blindly up at the bright blue sky, trying desperately to hold on to their fading memories of home.
Amidst this massive sea of complete despair, there are unbelievable acts of individual human heroism that completely defy logic.
Some incredibly brave officers and regular private soldiers completely refuse to leave their wounded friends behind. These are the men who will later be awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the absolute highest military honor for bravery. They willingly crawl back out into the deadly crossfire 5 or 6 different times, dragging heavily bleeding men back to the trenches by their thick canvas web gear. They throw themselves directly on top of live, ticking grenades to save the lives of the boys hiding next to them in the shell holes. They use their own bodies to block the incoming machine gun fire.
But no amount of individual human bravery can possibly stop the massive mechanical gears of this industrial slaughter. The individual heroes are eventually cut down right alongside the boys they are trying to protect. The terrifying mechanical roar of the battle continues to swallow the fragile human lives without any hesitation or remorse. The wounded boys trapped in the craters realize that their only possible chance of survival is to wait for the sun to completely set. They pray desperately for the dark cover of night to finally fall over the ruined valley. They lie in the bloody mud, listening to the terrible mechanical rhythm of the guns, and wait for the terrible day to end.
The bright, indifferent sun finally begins to slowly sink behind the completely ruined hills of the Somme Valley. The sky turns a dark, bruised purple. The absolute terror of the bright daylight slowly fades into the terrifying uncertainty of the night. The massive artillery guns finally begin to cool down. The completely deafening mechanical roar that has violently shaken the earth for the past 12 hours slowly dies away into isolated, scattered gunshots. But the battlefield does not become silent. As the heavy guns stop firing, a completely different and far more horrifying sound begins to rise from the thick darkness of no man's land. It is the sound of 30,000 wounded boys crying out in the pitch-black night.
It is an absolutely massive symphony of human agony that completely fills the cool night air. The moans of the dying mix violently with the desperate screams of those trapped in the rusted barbed wire. They are calling out for water. They are crying out the names of their mothers and their wives back home. It is a completely continuous, overlapping wall of sound that violently breaks the hearts of the surviving boys hiding safely in the British trenches. They press their dirty hands hard against their ears, trying desperately to block out the terrifying chorus of suffering. But the terrible sounds bleed through their fingers, completely inescapable and totally haunting. The darkness of the night is not a comforting blanket, but a terrifying, completely chaotic environment. The sky is suddenly violently illuminated by the harsh, bright glare of German magnesium star shells. These massive flares slowly drift down on small parachutes, casting long, terrifying dancing shadows across the massive piles of dead bodies. Every time a bright flare pops in the sky, the agonizing cries suddenly completely stop. The wounded boys desperately hold their breath and play dead, terrified that the bright artificial light will expose them to the completely merciless German snipers. As soon as the flare burns out and the heavy darkness returns, the terrible crying instantly begins again. Under the fragile cover of this chaotic darkness, the brave medical orderlies and stretcher bearers crawl desperately out into the killing fields. They cannot use flashlights or lanterns because any visible light will instantly draw heavy machine gun fire. They have to crawl blindly through the thick, wet mud, feeling their way with their bare, bleeding hands. They crawl over the cold, stiffening bodies of the dead, trying desperately to find the warm, breathing bodies of the living. When they find a wounded boy, they have to try and drag him slowly backward through the deep craters and tangled wire without making a single sound. The sheer physical effort of dragging a 160-pound man through thick, deep mud while staying completely flat on your stomach is absolutely unimaginable. For the lucky few who are still able to move their arms and legs, the night offers one desperate, final chance for survival. The boys who have been playing completely dead in the deep craters all day finally begin to move. They strip off their heavy, useless 66-pound canvas packs and drop their heavy steel helmets. They leave everything behind to make themselves as light and invisible as possible. They begin an absolutely terrifying, slow crawl back toward the British lines. They drag their shattered, bleeding legs through the cold, muddy water. They freeze completely still every time a bright German flare lights up the sky, violently pressing their faces deep into the rotting flesh of the dead bodies around them.
The journey back is a complete nightmare of confusion. The massive artillery bombardment has completely erased all familiar landmarks. The boys have absolutely no idea which direction the British trenches are. Some completely disoriented and deeply traumatized boys accidentally crawl the wrong way and end up right back at the thick German barbed wire, where they are instantly, violently killed by the nervous sentries. Others simply run out of physical strength halfway across the massive expanse of no man's land. They bleed to death slowly in the cold, dark mud, completely alone and totally forgotten.
The night drags on with an absolute terrifying slowness. The busy medical stations hidden deep in the trenches are completely overwhelmed by the massive, endless stream of shattered, bleeding bodies. The completely exhausted surgeons operate continuously by the dim yellow light of flickering kerosene lamps. The floor of the trenches is literally completely covered in severed limbs and blood-soaked bandages. As the dark sky slowly begins to turn a light, hazy gray, the true absolute horror of what has just happened begins to fully reveal itself. The massive, terrible mechanical machine of the first day has completely stopped grinding, but it leaves behind a completely broken, ruined landscape that will perfectly define the absolute tragedy of modern warfare for the rest of human history. The boys who survive the terrible night look out over the parapet at the massive fields of the dead and realize that their innocent lives are completely gone forever.
The morning of July 2 finally breaks over the completely shattered landscape of the Somme Valley. The thick gray fog slowly lifts to reveal a sight that completely defies all human understanding. The massive mechanical slaughter has finally paused. Now it is time to count the absolute terrible cost of the grand British plan. The brilliant generals sitting in their luxurious chateaus finally receive the horrifying reports from the front lines. The numbers written on those small pieces of paper are so completely staggering that they seem entirely impossible. On this one single day of fighting, the British Army has suffered a total of 57,200 casualties. Let that massive number sink deeply into your mind. 57,200 young men were violently killed or wounded or completely blown to pieces in just a few short hours of daylight. Out of that massive, terrifying number, exactly 19,400 boys are completely dead. They are lying perfectly still in the deep mud, entangled forever in the rusted barbed wire. This makes July 1 of the year 1916 the absolute bloodiest and most catastrophic single day in the entire long history of the British military. It is a level of sudden, violent destruction that completely surpasses the massive casualties of ancient wars that lasted for entire decades.
To truly understand the absolute scale of this immense tragedy, you have to picture a massive modern sports stadium completely filled to the very top row with cheering young men. Now imagine every single one of those boys being violently wiped out of existence before the sun even goes down. Entire proud battalions that marched into the staging trenches with 800 eager young volunteers are now reduced to just 50 or 60 completely traumatized survivors. The PALS battalions are completely eradicated. The young postmen and factory workers and school teachers from the exact same quiet streets back in England have all died exactly side by side. The devastating loss is so incredibly concentrated that it completely destroys the future of hundreds of tight-knit communities. The terrible black telegrams carrying the official notices of death will soon begin to flood the small local post offices. Entire towns will suddenly completely shut down as the horrific wailing of grieving mothers echoes through the empty streets.
But the massive tragedy is made even worse by the absolute cold cruelty of the military high command and the government. They completely refuse to admit the absolute catastrophic failure of their grand strategy. The official military reports sent back to the newspapers in London are completely filled with lies and terrifying propaganda. The bold black headlines tell the innocent public that the brave boys are advancing victoriously into German territory. They hide the massive, terrifying casualty numbers behind vague, heroic words. The generals simply cannot afford to let the civilian population know that their bright, beautiful sons were completely sacrificed for absolutely nothing.
They just draw completely new lines on their clean paper maps and immediately begin planning the exact same suicidal attacks for the very next day. The absolute horrific reality of the Somme is completely buried under a massive mountain of official silence and political lies. The 19,240 dead boys are completely voiceless. They cannot tell the world how they were violently betrayed by their own leaders. They simply lie silently in the freezing mud as the cold mechanical gears of the endless war continue to turn blindly forward.
The absolute most terrifying fact about the horrific slaughter of July 1 is that it was only the very beginning. The grand offensive did not stop after that one catastrophic failure. The massive Battle of the Somme continued to grind forward with absolutely no mercy for exactly 141 more days. The heavy autumn rains eventually turned the massive craters into deep, suffocating lakes of freezing mud. The soldiers continued to attack and defend the exact same useless piles of shattered bricks and poisoned earth until the middle of November. By the time the terrible offensive was finally completely halted by the bitter winter snow, the overall statistics had reached a level of absolute apocalyptic madness. Over 1 million young men from Britain and France and Germany were killed or wounded in this one single concentrated area. The beautiful green valley of the Picardy region had completely consumed the brightest and bravest youth of an entire continent. The Grand British Push had successfully captured a grand total of just 6 miles of completely ruined, worthless territory. Today, the completely silent landscape of the Somme still carries the deep physical scars of that massive mechanical nightmare. If you walk across those peaceful green fields today, you can still clearly see the massive, unnatural dips and rolling hills, perfectly formed by 100,000 exploding artillery shells. The farmers driving their modern tractors still constantly unearth the rusted, heavy iron shells and the fragmented white bones of the boys who never came home. The terrible, deep wound in the earth has been slowly covered by thick green grass and beautiful red poppy flowers, but it is never truly, completely healed. The entire landscape is completely dotted with hundreds of perfectly manicured military cemeteries. They are filled with absolutely endless rows of identical white gravestones, standing perfectly shoulder to shoulder, exactly like the boys did on that fateful morning. Far too many of those clean white stones simply read that they belong to a soldier of the Great War, known only unto God. Their bodies were so completely violently shattered by the massive industrial weapons that they simply lost their human identities forever.
Standing high above the peaceful rolling hills is the massive brick and stone arch of the Thiepval Memorial. It is an absolutely colossal monument built specifically to honor the missing dead of the Somme. Engraved deeply into the massive stone pillars are the names of over 72,000 British and South African boys who completely vanished into the mud without leaving a single trace behind. You can walk for hours reading the completely endless lists of names carved into the cold stone walls. Every single name represents a beautiful, destroyed universe of lost human potential and broken family dreams. The horrific tragedy of the Somme is the absolute ultimate lesson in the terrifying destructive power of modern industrial technology completely unleashed by blind human arrogance. It perfectly destroyed the romantic ancient illusion that war is a glorious, noble adventure. The boys who climbed out of those muddy trenches on that bright summer morning thought they were going to finally save the entire world. Instead, they walked blindly into an absolute mechanical hell that completely swallowed their generation whole. As the sun sets peacefully over the quiet green fields of France today, we must never completely forget the horrific price they paid. We must always remember the absolute deadly silence that followed the terrifying roar of the guns on the most tragic day in human history.